Hello, all, and I want to begin by apologizing for my recent absence. My life got a little hectic, and I wasn't able to really record very much and give out content at the usual rate that I try to give you guys. So I do want to apologize for that, and things going forward should be more steady. Now, I want to focus on this video on Aristotle's logic and epistemology, and this is sort of a prelude, if you will, an introduction to uh, Aristotle's logic, which of course is very famous and influential. But the writings themselves, with regards to the logic, is brought together post mortem, much like with the metaphysics that we discussed. And the terminology specifically would be the organon, or what we would call as the method. Now, the method, to give a short summation, goes as follows. You have the categories, the way in which the terms or words function in thought. You have interpretation, logic of propositions, assertions, or the denial of something. You have the prior analytic, which is the syllogisms, the composition of propositions, as propositions are composed of terms or made up of terms. The syllogism proposition with a minor premise to follow, or a smaller proposition. From the logical relationship, you then deduce the conclusion. So you follow along the chain of argument, if you will, with the prior analytic here, to have multiple propositions that lead into another, a main premise followed by a minor premise, and the relationship of those two are then concluded on with another proposition. Now, posterior analytic is the scientific reasoning. And so this is really how we get to first premises, how we can know first premises are grounded in truth. So the things that we deduce to begin with, the insight that we have, how do we know that it's truthful? And if it isn't, then we're going to have a serious problem if our first premises are flawed. And then you have the topics, or the dialectic, which he wrote the topics before he really discovered the syllogism, or at least how it would be used by him later. And this largely is confounded to rhetoric and debate. And then, of course, as follows, you have sophistical refutations, the logical fallacies that his contemporary sophists and his predecessors would use. And not only do they use logical fallacies, but they do so with the intent of doing so as well, which is another problem. Now, the Organon is basically a logic textbook, a logical guide. And if the route we took on this channel, where I started with Aristotle's metaphysics, the alternative, and I would say how many people really find Aristotle and are introduced to him, is largely through his logic here, through the Organon. Notice if you've ever taken a logic class in college, that many of how it's comprised of would be somewhat, or at least similar to how Aristotle's work here is comprised with the Organon. So it's massively influential for logic, of course. Now, with the categories to focus in here, we look at the ways in which Aristotle uses species. And that's really about his classification of different species as well as geniuses, and of course differentia. Aristotle is introducing this classification of things into species, which then conflate to a larger group, a genius, if you will, or a singular genius, and other large groups. So this Aristotelian classification is where, as differentia, or essential properties that differentiates other species, which then differentiates, of course, the larger categories or geniuses at hand. When Aristotle talks of rationality in social animals as beings, he is saying within the genius of animals, the differentia in the animal kingdom to us, the category of human beings, if you will, is our capacity for the social and rationality. So that's what the differentia in an Aristotelian example here is what makes humanity different from the other species, or the genius, if you will, of the animal hierarchy as a whole. So this classification system is why it is important to understand his premises then going forward of scientific reasoning and at large epistemology of these premises. Unless we know the truth about a species or a large group of genius, you cannot infer anything else about its category at hand. How can you argue about being unless you know the nature of being, or what is the moral good for human beings unless you know the differentia of human beings from other species? We must content with the essence or the nature of the things that we are categorically discussing here. Aristotle comes back to the categories, of course, that we initially talked about in the metaphysics as categories of being. Here, in this example, they're in the categories of thought. And the listing as follows is how he would set out with the a lack of particulars of terms, if you will, and what is the core system, if you will, of signifying these things, which is as follows: with substance, quality, relationship, how it's relative, qualification, when, where, being in the position, having, being effective, and doing. His point is you don't switch from one of these categories to another in a discussion. A classic example of this sort of contention in philosophical discussion is with Descartes' mind-body dualism, which has been, critiqued for centuries. And one of those critiques is that it is a categorical error in an Aristotelian sense. The bodily, of course, is a substance, but then he shifts categories of the mind as also a substance, instead of a function or a quality, according to someone like Ryle, for example. Aristotle is essentially saying that in a sort of chain argument of, setting propositions forth and linking them together, it is important that we don't switch out the categorical differences in our terminology during the discussion. Otherwise, we have a fallacy here. And so an example would be as follows: I love you, therefore I'm a lover. All the world loves a lover. You are all the world to me, therefore you love me. Now, of course, this doesn't work logically, and we notice the fallacy here of all the world being a categorical shift. All the world loves a lover is an empirical generalization. However, the shift here is when you are all the world to me, which is a value judgment. It is a categorical shift from an empirical generalization to now making a sort of value judgment. And so we see the shift here to go from a substance category to a value judgment. And Aristotle, of course, wants to avoid this and to link our propositions. They have to mean the same thing both times. You cannot categorically switch this out and come out with something truthful or something logical here. Such is the case with Aristotle with the two senses of the word substance, where he has primary and secondary. Primary, of course, to rehash here, is a particular, and the secondary is the forms. Now, with posterior analytics, this is very important to understand when tackling Aristotle. The problem Aristotle is how we can know these unchanging truths for certain and unchanging truths about classifications or general premises or notions about a particular species. We must know the essential nature of that species and what makes it and how it's differentia, if you will, from the other forms or species. But then we have to beg the question that Aristotle is going to ask going forward is, how can we know these forms? premises must be about the essential nature of something then, to draw further inferences with that same certainty going forward. And so he ranges the change on possibilities such as sense observation, which is going to fall short because, of course, sense observation and its awareness of it is relative to the angle of the perceiver at hand. So it's, images, if you will. But what about his teacher Plato? How can we know the forms through innate knowledge? Because, of course, the forms are transcendent for his teacher. And, of course, this is good thinking on Plato's end, because, of course, if the forms are transcendent and we knew them in a prior existence, in a prior lifetime, and therefore its memory is, hidden away, that is just waiting to come out. It's innate. It's something that can eventually be drawn out. Aristotle doesn't think this. Aristotle doesn't believe in this sort of transcendent forms. So Plato's idea of innate knowledge, his teacher, doesn't help him here. If they were innate, then people would be having self-discovery all the time. And, of course, you could argue to some extent maybe there is truth to that. People do have some sort of innate self-discovery, it seems, or at least we can be charitable here. But it isn't like you're running around having these sort of epiphanies about truth of a past life that you stumble upon on a consistent basis. That doesn't seem to happen very often, if at all. So we have to beg the question then, going forward with Aristotle, and as we turn to epistemology now in our discussions, how can we know these forms? And that's something that we're going to be tackling, and I hope you guys enjoy and tag along to watch.